Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is listen when everyone else chooses to ignore what's right in front of them. In 1893, Denver, a mountain man named Silas Boone sat uncomfortable at the governor's grand banquet, surrounded by crystal and silk, when he heard something that made his blood run cold: a woman crying behind the wall. While wealthy guests laughed and ate, Silas stood up, walked across the ballroom, and pressed his hand against the plaster. The sound grew louder. He grabbed a fireplace poker and smashed through the wall. What he found was a young woman, bruised and terrified, hidden away by powerful men who thought their secrets were safe. Her captor was sitting at the governor's own table. What happened next would shake the foundations of Denver's elite and prove that one honest man can bring down an empire built on lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Silas Boone woke to the sound of elk bugling in the valley below his cabin. The morning air bit cold against his face as he stepped outside, boots crunching on frost-covered ground. He was a tall man, weathered by 57 years of hard living, with a beard gone mostly grey and hands that bore the scars of 1,000 small battles with the wilderness. His cabin sat nestled in a high meadow in the Colorado Rockies, miles from the nearest settlement, exactly the way he preferred it. He'd built the place himself 20 years ago, after the fever took his wife and daughter in the same terrible week. Couldn't bear to stay in the settlement after that, surrounded by memories of their laughter, their warmth, the life he'd thought would last forever. So he'd packed what little mattered and walked into the mountains until he found a place that felt far enough from the pain. The cabin was simple, one room with a stone fireplace, a bed he'd framed from pine, shelves for his few books and his worn leather journal where he sketched the trails he explored and pressed wildflowers between the pages. Most days passed in quiet routine. He checked his traps, hunted for meat, split wood for the fire. He tracked the seasons by the animals: elk in autumn, bear sign in spring, eagles circling overhead in the bright winter sky. He spoke to no one for months at a time, and that suited him fine. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was clean, honest, uncomplicated by the disappointments people brought. But 3 weeks ago, that silence had been broken by gunfire. Silas had been following a deer trail down the eastern ridge when he heard the shots. Rapid, panicked, the unmistakable sound of an ambush. He'd moved toward it carefully, rifle ready, and come upon a scene of chaos on the narrow road below. A stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel still spinning. Bodies of the driver and guard sprawled in the dirt. 4 masked men on horseback circled the wreckage, shouting at someone inside. Silas had seen enough road agents in his years as a scout to know how this would end if he didn't act. He positioned himself on the ridge, found his sight line, and fired 3 careful shots. 2 of the bandits dropped. The other 2 wheeled their horses and fled into the trees, smart enough to know when the odds had turned. When Silas climbed down to the coach, he found a young man inside, maybe 25, dressed in a fine suit, now covered in road dust. The man was shaking but unhurt, clutching a leather satchel to his chest like it held his life's savings. "Thank you," the young man had gasped. "My God, thank you. They would have killed me." Silas had just nodded, already regretting his involvement. He helped the young man bury the driver and guard, then guided him on foot to the nearest town, a full day's walk. The young man talked the entire way, nervous chatter about his father, about important business in Denver, about how grateful his family would be. His name was Thomas Mitchell. His father was Senator Howard Mitchell, one of Colorado's representatives in Washington. Thomas had been traveling with documents related to some railroad expansion his father was sponsoring. The bandits had known exactly which coach to hit. When they reached town, Thomas had been effusive in his gratitude. He'd insisted on knowing Silas's name, insisted on writing it down, insisted that his father would want to thank him properly. Silas had tried to refuse, tried to slip away, but Thomas was persistent in the way only young men raised with privilege could be. "My father is hosting the governor's annual banquet in 2 weeks," Thomas had said. "In Denver. Please, you must attend as our honored guest. It's the least we can do." Silas had declined firmly multiple times, but Thomas wouldn't hear it. He'd arranged for the invitation to be sent to the trading post, where Silas collected his mail twice a year. The postmaster, old Samuel Briggs, had ridden up to Silas's cabin himself to deliver it, grinning like he'd brought news of a gold strike. "Says here you're invited to dine with the governor," Samuel had said, handing over the cream-colored envelope with its wax seal. "Fancy that, Silas, you rubbing elbows with high society." Silas had tried to ignore it. He'd set the invitation on his shelf and gone about his business, but something about it nagged at him. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas's earnest face, the young man's genuine desire to show gratitude. Maybe it was something deeper, a small voice suggesting that hiding in the mountains forever wasn't the same as healing. On the morning he was supposed to leave for Denver, Silas stood in his cabin doorway and looked out at the peaks he'd called home for 2 decades. The sun was just cresting the ridgeline, painting the snow gold and pink. An eagle circled overhead, riding the thermals. Everything in him wanted to stay, but he'd given his word in a way. And a man's word mattered, even when given reluctantly. He packed light, a clean shirt, his good jacket that still smelled of cedar from the chest, his journal. He left his rifle but wore his knife. The ride to Denver took 3 days, each mile carrying him further from the silence he'd built his life around and closer to the noise and crowd of civilization. Denver had grown since he'd last seen it. Buildings of brick and stone reached 3 and 4 stories high. Electric lights buzzed on poles along the main streets. Horseless carriages, automobiles they called them, puttered past, frightening the horses. The air smelled of coal smoke and sewage, and too many people pressed too close together. The governor's mansion sat on a hill overlooking the city, a massive structure of white stone with columns and balconies and windows that glittered in the afternoon sun. Carriages lined the circular drive, delivering guests in evening wear. Silas felt profoundly out of place in his simple jacket and worn boots. Even though they were the finest things he owned, a butler met him at the door, looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain, then checked the guest list. "Mr. Boone, yes, Senator Mitchell is expecting you. This way, please." Inside, the mansion was a palace. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. Marble floors reflected the light like ice. Gold leaf decorated every frame, every banister, every surface that could be adorned. Men in black tailcoats and women in gowns of silk and satin moved through the halls, their laughter echoing off the walls. Senator Mitchell found him in the entrance hall, Thomas at his side. The senator was a robust man in his 50s, with silver hair and a politician's practiced smile. But his gratitude seemed genuine as he clasped Silas's hand. "Mr. Boone, Thomas has told me everything. You saved my son's life. There are no words adequate to express my thanks. Just did what needed doing," Silas said quietly. "Modesty only makes the deed more remarkable," Mitchell said. "Please, you're our guest of honor tonight. The governor himself wants to meet you." They led him into the ballroom, and Silas felt his throat tighten. Hundreds of people filled the space, all of them draped in wealth and comfort he couldn't fathom. Long tables groaned under the weight of food. Roasted meats, delicate pastries, fruits out of season, bottles of wine that probably cost more than he spent in a year. A piano played in the corner, something soft and elegant that seemed to drift through the conversations like perfume. Silas was introduced to dozens of people whose names he immediately forgot. They shook his hand, called him a hero, asked inane questions about mountain living as though he were some exotic creature put on display for their amusement. He answered politely, briefly, counting the hours until he could leave. Finally, Senator Mitchell guided him to a seat at one of the main tables, not far from where Governor Holloway himself sat with his family and closest associates. Silas sat, uncomfortable in the delicate chair, and tried to make himself small while the feast began around him. That was when his carefully maintained composure began to crack. As the guests ate and drank and laughed, as speeches were made about progress and prosperity and Denver's bright future, Silas found himself thinking about the families he'd known on the frontier, families who worked themselves to exhaustion just to survive the winter. Children who went hungry when the crops failed. Good people who lived and died in obscurity, while these wealthy few congratulated themselves on their virtue. The contrast wasn't just uncomfortable, it was obscene. And then, beneath the music and the laughter, he heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the noise. A sound that didn't belong. A sound that made his blood run cold. Someone was crying behind the wall. Silas stopped moving, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully and listened. The woman beside him, draped in emeralds and self-satisfaction, was talking about her recent trip to Paris, but her voice faded to nothing as Silas focused on that other sound. Yes, there it was again. Muffled, desperate, coming from somewhere behind the ornate plaster wall to his left. He turned to the man on his other side, a banker named Whitmore. "You hear that?" Whitmore paused mid-chew. "Hear what?" "That crying." "Behind the wall." Whitmore listened for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't hear anything. Probably just the pipes. These old buildings, you know, always making noise." But the mansion wasn't old, and Silas knew the sound of pipes. This was different. This was human suffering, close and urgent. He scanned the faces around him. No one else seemed to notice. They were too absorbed in their food, their wine, their conversations about things that didn't matter. The governor was speaking now, standing at the head table with a crystal glass raised high. "To Denver," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "To progress, prosperity, and the bright future we're building together." The crowd erupted in applause. Glasses clinked. The piano swelled into something triumphant. And beneath it all, that crying grew louder, more frantic, as though whoever was trapped knew this might be their last chance to be heard. Silas couldn't sit still anymore. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor. Several heads turned toward him, curious, mildly annoyed at the disruption. Senator Mitchell caught his eye from across the table, concern creasing his forehead. "Mr. Boone, is something wrong?" Silas didn't answer. He walked toward the wall, his boots heavy against the floor, each step drawing more attention. The conversations around him began to die away. The pianist faltered, uncertain whether to continue. By the time Silas reached the wall, half the room was watching him. He pressed his palm against the plaster. It was cool, solid, but not quite right. There was a hollow quality to it, a space behind that shouldn't be there. The crying was clearer now, desperate and raw. A woman's voice choked with fear. "Sir, please return to your seat," someone said behind him. One of the governor's men, by the sound of authority in his voice. Silas ignored him. He moved along the wall, pressing his hand against different sections, feeling for the edges of whatever had been constructed here. The plaster was smooth, painted to match the rest of the ballroom, but there was a seam, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. A section that had been added, plastered over, hidden behind the elegance. "Mr. Boone!" The governor himself was on his feet now, his face flushed. "What on earth are you doing?" "You're disturbing our guests." Silas turned to face the room. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him, some confused, some annoyed, some frightened by the wild mountain man who'd invaded their civilized gathering. He saw Senator Mitchell standing, uncertain whether to defend him or restrain him. He saw Thomas, pale and worried, and he saw another man, seated near the governor, whose face had gone from ruddy satisfaction to ashen fear. Edmund Holloway, the governor's younger brother. Silas had been introduced to him earlier, had marked him as the kind of man who smiled too much and meant none of it. Now Edmund was half out of his chair, one hand reaching toward the governor as if to stop what was about to happen. "There's someone behind this wall," Silas said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Someone who needs help." "That's absurd," the governor sputtered. "This wall has been here for years." "No, it hasn't." Silas rapped his knuckles against the plaster. The sound echoed hollow. "This was put up recent. And there's a woman crying behind it." "I don't hear anything," someone called out. Others murmured agreement. The woman in emeralds laughed nervously. Perhaps the mountain air has affected his hearing. But Silas saw the truth in Edmund Holloway's face. Saw the panic, the calculation, the desperate attempt to maintain composure. And he knew with the certainty that came from decades of reading men's intentions in the wilderness, that whatever was behind this wall, Edmund Holloway had put it there. Step away from the wall. "Sir!" Two of the governor's guards moved toward him, hands on their batons. "You need to leave." Silas looked at them, then at the wall, then at the brass fireplace poker leaning against the hearth nearby. He'd come to this place out of obligation, had suffered through hours of discomfort and false pleasantries, had been patient with people who saw him as a curiosity. But patience had its limits, and some things mattered more than manners. He walked to the fireplace, picked up the poker, heavy, solid brass with a curved hook at one end, and turned back to the wall. "Don't you dare," the governor commanded. "Guards, stop him." But Silas was already swinging. The poker hit the plaster with a crack that echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Dust and paint chips exploded outward. Screams erupted from the guests. The guards rushed forward, but Senator Mitchell stepped into their path, his voice booming with authority. "Let him finish." Silas swung again, and again. Great chunks of plaster fell away, revealing the wooden frame behind it, and behind that, darkness. The crying was clear now, no longer muffled, raw and terrified and hopeful all at once. One more swing, and the wood splintered. Silas dropped the poker and used his hands, tearing away boards, pulling aside debris, widening the hole until he could see inside. A face appeared in the darkness. Young, gaunt, bruised, eyes wide with disbelief. A woman, maybe 25, her dress torn, her dark hair matted, her hands clutching a piece of silk, a scarf torn and stained. She was shaking violently, whether from cold or fear or relief. Silas couldn't tell. "Help me," she whispered. "Please help me." The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. No music, no conversation, not even the sound of breathing. Every person stood frozen, staring at the impossible sight of a woman emerging from the wall like a ghost made flesh. Silas reached in carefully and took her hand. It was ice cold. He pulled gently, helping her climb through the opening, steadying her as she stumbled into the light. Her legs barely held her. She collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest, her whole body racked with the force of her release. "Sweet, merciful God," someone breathed. The woman pulled back slightly, her eyes sweeping the room until they found what they were looking for. Her hand, still clutching the torn silk scarf, rose and pointed directly at Edmund Holloway. "Him," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He did this. He locked me in there. Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "His name is Edmund Holloway. 3 weeks ago he asked me to marry him. When I refused, he brought me here by force. He said no one would believe me. He said I would stay there until I agreed to be his wife, until I learned my place." Edmund shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. "She's lying. She's clearly mad. I've never seen this woman before in my life." "Your ring," the woman said, pointing at his hand. "You showed it to me. You said it was your mother's, said I would wear it. Gold band with 3 small diamonds. You wear it on your left hand." Edmund's face crumbled. He looked at his hand, at the ring that was exactly as she described, then at the crowd of witnesses who had seen the truth written in his panic. He bolted for the door. He didn't make it 3 steps before Senator Mitchell's voice rang out. "Guards, seize that man!" The guards who had been moving towards Silas changed direction, intercepting Edmund before he reached the exit. He struggled, shouting denials, making wild accusations, but they held him firm. The governor stood motionless at the head table, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. His brother, his own blood. The implications spread across his features like a stain. The woman in Silas's arms continued sobbing, but there was something different in it now. Not just fear and pain, but relief. The terrible relief of finally being seen, being heard, being believed. Silas held her carefully, the way he might hold something broken that needed time to mend. The ballroom erupted into chaos around them. Guests shouting, guards restraining Edmund, the governor calling for order, Senator Mitchell demanding answers. But Silas stayed focused on the woman, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now," he told her. "I've got you." "You're safe." She looked up at him, her bruised face streaked with tears, and nodded. Catherine, she whispered. My name is Catherine Mercer. Catherine. Silas repeated the name, committing it to memory. I'm Silas, and I promise you no one's going to hurt you again. Behind them, Edmund's voice rose above the chaos, shrill and desperate. You don't understand. She's nothing, she's nobody. You're destroying everything for— Shut your mouth, the governor said, his voice dead and cold. He was staring at the hole in the wall, at the dark space where his brother had hidden a human being, at the evidence of a crime so monstrous it would destroy everything the family had built. Just shut your mouth. Senator Mitchell approached Silas and Catherine, his face grave. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere she can be cared for properly. Silas nodded, but didn't let go. Catherine's grip on his jacket had tightened, as though she feared that letting go meant being swallowed back into darkness. My home, Mitchell said. My wife was a nurse before we married. Catherine will be safe there, and we'll send for a doctor. What about him? Silas gestured toward Edmund, now being held by 4 guards, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen. He'll answer for this, Mitchell said, his voice hard. Whatever it takes, however high this goes, he'll answer for this. The governor was watching them now, and something in his eyes made Silas's instincts flare. It wasn't shock he saw there anymore. It was calculation. The wheels were already turning behind that carefully maintained facade. Weighing options, considering damage control, thinking about how to protect the family name. Silas met his gaze steadily, and in that moment both men understood. This wasn't over. Not by a long measure. The woman had been freed, but justice, real justice, was going to be a battle, one Silas Boone wasn't planning to walk away from. The chaos in the ballroom continued for another hour. Guests departed in clusters, whispering urgently to one another, already spinning the story they'd tell at tomorrow's social gatherings. The governor retreated to his study with his advisers, leaving the guards to manage Edmund, who had finally stopped protesting and sat in sullen silence, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale. Silas stayed close to Catherine as Senator Mitchell's carriage was brought around. She hadn't let go of his jacket, her fingers clutching the worn leather as though it were the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself hollow. When they helped her into the carriage, she looked back at him with such raw fear that Silas climbed in beside her without thinking. I'll ride along, he said to Mitchell. If that's all right. Mitchell nodded, understanding in his eyes. Thomas climbed in as well, and the 4 of them rode through Denver's gaslit streets in heavy silence. Catherine stared out the window at the city passing by, and Silas wondered what she was seeing, freedom, or just another cage with prettier bars. The Mitchell home was a substantial brick house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the mansion's ostentation, but comfortable in a way that spoke of old money and good taste. Mrs. Mitchell met them at the door, a handsome woman in her 50s, whose eyes widened at the sight of Catherine's condition, but who asked no questions. Simply took the young woman's arm with gentle firmness. Come with me, dear. Let's get you cleaned up and into bed. You're safe here. Catherine looked back at Silas one more time before allowing herself to be led away. He nodded to her, a silent promise that he would still be there when she emerged. In the senator's study, the 3 men sat in leather chairs that smelled of pipe smoke and old books. Mitchell poured whiskey into crystal glasses and handed them around. Silas took his but didn't drink. His mind was too busy sorting through what had happened, what it meant, what came next. Tell me the truth, Senator, Silas said quietly. Is Edmund Holloway going to face justice for this? Mitchell took a long drink before answering. I want to say yes. God knows I want to say yes. But you saw the governor's face. That wasn't a man preparing to prosecute his own brother. That was a man calculating how to minimize damage, so he walks free? Silas felt anger rising in his chest, hot and dangerous. I didn't say that. Mitchell leaned forward, his eyes hard. I have some influence in this territory. The newspapers respect me. I can apply pressure, make sure this doesn't disappear quietly. But you need to understand what we're up against. The Holloway family has controlled Denver politics for 20 years. They have judges, police chiefs, newspaper editors in their pocket. Edmund could have witnesses disappear, evidence destroyed. The whole thing buried under legal maneuvering. Then what's the point? Thomas said, his young face troubled. If the system is that corrupt, how do we fight it? We make sure Catherine's story is heard, Mitchell said. We find other witnesses, other victims if they exist. We build a case so airtight that even the governor can't ignore it without destroying his own credibility. Silas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. She'll testify after what she's been through. That's her choice to make, Mitchell said. We can't force her. But if she's willing, her testimony could be powerful. The daughter of... He paused, something shifting in his expression. Catherine Mercer. I thought the name was familiar. Her father was Richard Mercer, one of the original silver miners who struck it rich in Leadville. He died 6 months ago, left her a considerable fortune. Understanding clicked into place for Silas, so Edmund wasn't just obsessed. He wanted her money. Probably both, Mitchell said grimly. Edmund has always lived beyond his means, relying on his brother's position to cover his debts. A wife with a mining fortune would solve a lot of problems for him, and when she refused, he took what he thought was his due. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Men like Edmund see women as property to be acquired. When one has the audacity to say no, they find ways to break that will. Silas turned back from the window. Has anyone contacted her family? Someone who should know she's alive? Mitchell's expression grew sad. Her father was her only close family. There are cousins in the East, I believe, but from what I recall, Richard Mercer kept his daughter close after his wife died. Catherine would have been quite alone after he passed, making her an easy target, Thomas said quietly. Yes. Mitchell stood, suddenly looking older, weary. Get some rest, both of you. Tomorrow, we start gathering evidence. I'll send word to the courthouse. Make sure Edmund is held pending investigation. But Silas... He fixed the mountain man with a serious look. This is going to get ugly. The Holloways will fight back, and they'll fight dirty. If you want to return to your mountains, no one would blame you. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Silas thought of Catherine's face, the way she'd pointed at Edmund with a hand that shook but didn't waver. The way she'd trusted Silas enough to hold on to him, a stranger, because he was the only one who had listened. I'll stay, he said. Until this is finished, Mitchell nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. Thomas will show you to a guest room. As Thomas led him upstairs, Silas heard voices from one of the bedrooms, Mrs. Mitchell's soothing tones and Catherine's softer responses. He paused outside the door, not eavesdropping exactly, just making sure she was all right. You're safe now, Mrs. Mitchell was saying. No one can hurt you here. He said no one would believe me. Catherine's voice was small, raw. He said I was nothing without my father. That I should be grateful he was willing to marry me at all. That man is a liar and a criminal, Mrs. Mitchell said firmly. And you are remarkably brave. To survive what you did, to speak up when you had the chance, that takes more courage than most people have in their whole lives. A long pause. Then, the man who found me, the one with the grey beard, is he still here? Mr. Boone. Yes, he's staying with us tonight. I want to thank him properly when I wasn't so broken. You're not broken, dear. You're healing. There's a difference. And Mr. Boone isn't going anywhere. You can thank him tomorrow. Silas moved away from the door, his chest tight. He'd spent 20 years avoiding connections, avoiding the possibility of caring about people who could be taken away. But Catherine Mercer had been taken, had been hidden away like she didn't matter. And something about that cut through all his carefully maintained distance. In the guest room, he found his saddlebag waiting for him, brought in by one of the Mitchell household staff. He pulled out his leather journal and opened it to a blank page. For a long time, he just sat there, pen in hand, trying to find words for what he'd witnessed tonight. Finally, he wrote, "Found a woman locked behind a wall today. Rich folk had been eating and drinking 20 feet away from her suffering and never heard a thing. Or maybe they heard and didn't want to know. Sometimes I think the wilderness is less savage than what people call civilization." He set the pen down and closed the journal. Through the window, he could see the lights of Denver spreading out below. thousands of them, each one representing someone living their life, pursuing their happiness, building their future. How many of those lights hid darkness like Edmund Holloway's? How many secrets were plastered over, painted to match, hidden behind elegant walls? A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Senator Mitchell entered, carrying a small envelope. "This was delivered to the house just now. For you." Silas took it, frowning. The envelope was expensive paper, sealed with wax. He broke the seal and pulled out a single card with a message written in elegant script. "Return to your mountains, Mr. Boone. This matter does not concern you." Those who interfere in family business often find themselves wishing they hadn't. No signature. No need for one. The threat was clear enough. Silas handed the card to Mitchell, who read it and swore softly. "They're already moving, trying to intimidate you into leaving." "They're going to need to try harder than that," Silas said calmly. He took the card back, walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. They both watched it curl and blacken, the threat dissolving into ash. "Good," Mitchell said, "because we're going to need you. Tomorrow I'm going to the governor's mansion to examine that wall, look for more evidence. I want you there with me. Your testimony about what you heard, what you found, it's crucial. I'll be there." After Mitchell left, Silas lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible, but eventually it came, bringing dreams of walls closing in and cries that went unheard and a brass poker that grew too heavy to lift. He woke before dawn to the sound of someone screaming. His body moved before his mind caught up, rushing into the hallway in time to see Mrs. Mitchell hurrying toward Catherine's room. He followed, his heart hammering. Catherine sat upright in bed, her eyes wide and unseeing, still caught in whatever nightmare had seized her. Mrs. Mitchell sat beside her, speaking softly, drawing the young woman back to the present, to safety, to the reality that she was no longer trapped. When Catherine finally focused on them, her face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake everyone." "Hush now." Mrs. Mitchell pulled her into an embrace. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing at all." Over Mrs. Mitchell's shoulder, Catherine's eyes found Silas standing in the doorway. Something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a shared knowledge that some rescues were just the beginning, not the end. That freedom from a physical prison didn't mean freedom from what had been done in that darkness. Silas nodded to her, then retreated to give her privacy. But as he returned to his room, he made himself a promise. He would stay until this was truly finished. Until Edmund Holloway faced justice, until Catherine could sleep without screaming, however long that took, whatever it cost. Some things were worth fighting for, even for a man who'd spent 20 years running from the fight. That evening, after dinner, Silas found Catherine sitting alone on the veranda, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. The city spread out below them, lights twinkling in the darkness like earthbound stars. He hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but she turned and saw him. "Please," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. "I could use the company." He sat, settling into the wicker chair that creaked under his weight. For a while they just sat in comfortable silence, watching the night. "Tell me about your mountains," Catherine said finally. "What's it like living up there alone?" Silas considered the question. Quiet, simple. You wake with the sun, sleep when it gets dark. Your problems are straightforward. Finding food, staying warm, watching for weather changes. No politics, no games, no people pretending to be something they're not. It sounds peaceful. It is. Most of the time, he paused, watching an owl glide silently across the garden. But it's also lonely. Even when you tell yourself you prefer it that way. Catherine pulled the shawl tighter. "I know something about loneliness. After my mother died, it was just father and me. He tried, but he was always working, always building his business, making sure I'd be provided for. I spent a lot of time alone in that big house, reading books, imagining the life I'd have someday." Her voice grew bitter. "I certainly never imagined this. What did you imagine?" "Oh, the usual romantic notions. Someone who would see me, really see me, not just my father's money. Children, maybe. A home full of warmth and laughter instead of empty rooms and silence. Simple things, but they felt possible once. She turned to look at him. "Why did you go to the mountains? You said you lost your wife and daughter, but there must have been more to it than that." Silas was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with memories he usually kept locked away. "After they died, I couldn't stop seeing them everywhere. In our house, in the settlement, in the faces of other children playing in the street. It wasn't just grief. It was like I was drowning in it, and every familiar place pushed me deeper. I thought if I could just get far enough away, if I could surround myself with something completely different, maybe I could breathe again." Did it work? Eventually. The mountains didn't judge me for not being over it, didn't tell me to move on, or find someone new, or any of the other useless things people say when they don't know what else to offer. The mountains just were, and that was enough. Catherine nodded slowly. "I think I understand that. After Father died, everyone had advice. Marry quickly, they said, before I made poor decisions with the inheritance. Find a strong man to manage things. As if I were a child who couldn't be trusted." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Edmund said the same things, only he made them sound like care instead of control. I almost believed him at first. When did you realize what he really was? There was a moment, about 3 weeks before he took me. We were at a charity function, and a woman accidentally spilled wine on his jacket. He smiled, told her it was fine, helped her clean it up. But later, when we were alone, he said terrible things about her, called her clumsy and stupid and worthless. The venom in his voice, it was like seeing behind a mask. I realized the charming man everyone saw was just a performance, and underneath was something cruel and cold. That's when you wrote the letter to your father. Yes, but I was too late. Father died 3 days later suddenly from his heart. And Edmund moved quickly, before I could warn anyone, before I could understand how dangerous he really was. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I keep thinking about the other women Senator Mitchell mentioned. Did they see that moment too? That glimpse behind the mask? Or did Edmund hide it better with them?" "We'll find out tomorrow," Silas said. "And if they're willing to speak, their stories combined with yours, it'll be harder for Edmund to dismiss all of you as hysterical or confused. What if they're too afraid? What if the money the governor paid them was enough to buy their silence forever?" "Fear and money can keep people quiet," Silas acknowledged. "But truth has a funny way of demanding to be told. Sometimes it just takes one person being brave enough to speak first." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "You've given me that, you know. The courage to speak. Every time I want to give up, to accept Edmund's offer and disappear somewhere far from Denver, I think about you standing in that ballroom, breaking through that wall when everyone else told you not to. If you could be that brave for a stranger, the least I can do is be brave for myself." Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out his leather journal. He opened it to a page near the middle, where a small wildflower was pressed between sheets of thin paper. The petals had kept their color, deep purple and gold, even though they'd been there for years. "This is mountain columbine," he said, carefully removing the flower and handing it to Catherine. "Grows at high altitude, in places where nothing else can survive. When cold, thin air doesn't matter. It comes up every spring, beautiful as anything you'd find in a greenhouse garden." Catherine took the flower gently, cradling it in her palm. "It's lovely." "Strong things grow in hard places," Silas said quietly. "That's what my wife used to tell Sarah when she was struggling with something. That the hardest times are what make us who we need to be." He met Catherine's eyes. "You're like that flower, Catherine. What Edmund did to you was meant to break you, to make you small and controllable. But you're still here, still standing, still fighting. That's not weakness. That's strength most people never have to find in themselves." Tears ran down Catherine's cheeks now, but she didn't try to hide them. "Thank you for this, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already have," Silas said. "You've reminded me that isolation isn't the same as peace, that there are things worth coming down from the mountain for." She held the flower up to the light spilling from the house windows, examining its delicate structure. "May I keep this?" "It's yours." Catherine stood, still holding the flower carefully, and surprised Silas by leaning down to kiss his weathered cheek. "Good night, Silas, and thank you for not looking away when you could have." After she'd gone inside, Silas sat alone on the veranda for a long time, thinking about the conversation, about the flower he'd carried for years and finally found a reason to share. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed across the city. He thought about his cabin in the high meadow, about the solitude he'd built his life around. It would still be there when this was over. The mountains weren't going anywhere, but something had changed in him, something he couldn't quite name yet. The walls he'd built around his heart were still there, but they had cracks now, places where light was getting through. Maybe that was all right. Maybe it was even good. The front door opened, and Senator Mitchell stepped out, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He offered one to Silas, then settled into the chair Catherine had vacated. "I received word an hour ago," Mitchell said. "Rebecca Townsend has agreed to meet with us tomorrow. She's willing to hear what we have to say, but she's not committing to anything. Her family is frightened of retribution. Can you protect them?" "I can try. I have some influence, some resources. But the Holloways have more." Mitchell took a long drink. "I'll be honest with you, Silas. The odds aren't in our favor. Even if Rebecca testifies, even if we build the strongest case possible, there's a good chance Edmund walks free. The system is designed to protect men like him. Then we change the system," Mitchell smiled grimly. "Spoken like a man who's never dealt with politics. Systems don't change easily. They fight back hard. Everything worth doing fights back," Silas said. "It doesn't mean you stop trying." They sat in silence, sipping their whiskey, 2 men who'd come to this fight from very different places, but who were now bound together by a shared purpose. In the morning, they would go meet Rebecca Townsend. They would try to convince her to speak. They would take another step in a battle that might already be lost. But tonight, sitting on this veranda under the stars, with the taste of good whiskey and the memory of Catherine's tears, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like he mattered, like what he did made a difference. Like maybe, just maybe, the world could be pushed toward justice if enough people were willing to push. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was purpose, and after 2 decades in the mountains, running from purpose, that felt like coming home. The Townsend family lived on the outskirts of Denver, in a modest neighborhood that spoke of middle-class respectability. Rebecca's father, William, answered the door with suspicion written across his weathered face. He was a man in his 60s, a carpenter by trade, if the sawdust on his vest was any indication. "Senator Mitchell," he said with forced politeness. "You said this would be brief. It will be. Thank you for agreeing to see us." Mitchell gestured to Silas. "This is Silas Boone. He's the man who discovered Catherine Mercer." Recognition flickered in William's eyes, followed by something that looked like guilt. He stepped aside to let them enter. The house was small but well kept, everything in its place, surfaces polished with care. Rebecca sat in the front room, a woman of perhaps 27 with dark hair and careful eyes. She wore a simple dress and kept her hands folded in her lap, the picture of composed femininity. But Silas saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the door as though planning an escape route. "Miss Townsend," Mitchell said gently, "thank you for seeing us." "I'm not sure what you expect me to tell you," Rebecca said quietly. "What happened 2 years ago is in the past. My family and I have moved forward. Have you?" Silas asked, his directness cutting through the polite pretense. "Or have you just gotten better at pretending?" Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. She looked at her father, who shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Boone means no disrespect," Mitchell interjected. "But we're here because we believe Edmund Holloway has hurt other women. Catherine Mercer is willing to testify about what he did to her. If there are others who will stand with her—" "No!" William Townsend's voice was firm. "We had an agreement. The governor compensated us for Rebecca's, for the incident. We accepted those terms. That money put my younger children through school, saved our home when my business was failing. I won't have it all undone because someone else had trouble with Edmund Holloway. Trouble. Silas kept his voice even, but barely. He imprisoned your daughter. He traumatized her. And the governor paid you to keep quiet about it. You don't understand, William said defensively. Rebecca was gone for 3 months. When she came back, she wasn't the same. We needed money for doctors, for treatment, for helping her recover. The governor offered us a way to move forward, to rebuild our lives. We took it, and in doing so, you left Edmund free to hurt other women, Mitchell said. Catherine was locked behind a wall for 3 weeks because no one warned her what Edmund was capable of. Rebecca made a small sound, almost a sob. Her father moved to her side, protective, but she shook her head and straightened. "Tell me about Catherine," she said to Silas. "Is she all right?" Silas sat down across from her, eye level, treating her with the respect she deserved. "She's healing, but she has nightmares. Wakes up screaming, thinking she's back in the dark. She's afraid Edmund will never face consequences, that people will believe his lies instead of her truth." "They will believe his lies," Rebecca said bitterly. "That's what powerful men do. They have better liars than we have truth." "Maybe," Silas acknowledged. "But you could change that. Your testimony, combined with Catherine's, combined with whatever evidence we can gather, it might be enough to break through the lies." Rebecca looked at her hands. "When I disappeared 2 years ago, my family thought I'd run away. I'd been seeing a boy they didn't approve of, and they thought I'd chosen him over them. But Edmund had taken me to a house outside the city, kept me there. He said the same things he must have said to Catherine, that I would marry him, that I would learn to love him, that no one would believe me if I tried to tell them what he'd done." Her father's face had gone pale. Silas realized he'd never heard the full story, had taken the governor's money without knowing exactly what his daughter had endured. "He let me go eventually," Rebecca continued. "Said he'd changed his mind, that I wasn't worthy of the Holloway name after all. I came home broken, unable to tell anyone what had happened because who would believe me? Edmund Holloway, pillar of the community, versus Rebecca Townsend, the carpenter's daughter who disappeared with a questionable boyfriend." She laughed hollow. "Then the governor came, offered money, lots of it, in exchange for our silence, for my promise never to speak of Edmund's name in connection with what happened. Father thought he was being generous, helping us rebuild after my troubles." "Becky," William whispered, his voice breaking. "You never told me. You thought what, Papa? That I was a foolish girl who got herself into trouble? That the governor's money was charity for our family's shame?" Rebecca stood, her composure finally shattering. "I let you think that because it was easier than telling you the truth. Easier than seeing you realize you'd taken blood money and there was nothing you could do about it." Silas watched the father and daughter, saw 20 years of unspoken pain suddenly visible between them. Mitchell waited, letting the moment breathe, understanding that this was necessary before anything else could happen. "There's another woman," Mitchell said quietly. "At least one more that we know of. A girl named Margaret Keene who disappeared 4 years ago. Her family was also paid by the governor. We're trying to locate her now." 4 years, Rebecca said, her voice hardening. 4 years of Edmund hurting women, and the governor cleaning up after him, paying families to look away. She turned to Silas. "You found Catherine by accident, didn't you? If you hadn't been at that banquet, if you hadn't heard her, she'd still be there," Silas finished. "Or dead. Edmund was getting more reckless, keeping her in the governor's own mansion. He would have had to do something with her eventually." Rebecca walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. "I want to help. God help me, I want to make Edmund pay for what he did. But if I testify, if I break the agreement, the governor will take the money back. He'll ruin my family. He'll make sure my father never works in this city again." "He might try," Mitchell said, "but I have some influence of my own. I can offer protection, help your father find work if needed. It won't be easy, but—" "No," William Townsend stood, his face set. "It's my decision to make. This is my fault. I took that money without understanding what it meant, what it cost. Becky suffered, and I let her suffer in silence because I was too much of a coward to ask questions." He looked at his daughter with tears in his eyes. If you want to testify, if you want to stand up and tell the truth, then that's what we'll do. And whatever comes after, we'll face it together. The way we should have 2 years ago. Rebecca turned from the window, her own tears flowing freely now. Father and daughter embraced, 20 years of distance closing in that single moment. Mitchell pulled a leather portfolio from his bag. Before you make any final decision, there's something you should see. Silas, earlier you asked about the governor's direct involvement. I did some investigating after we learned about the payments to Rebecca's family. What I found, he opened the portfolio. This is a ledger, private accounting records from the governor's personal office. I acquired them through a source who wishes to remain anonymous. He laid the ledger on the table. Silas and Rebecca leaned in to look. The pages were filled with entries in neat handwriting, dates and amounts, and brief descriptions. There, Mitchell pointed. February 1891, payment to William Townsend, $2,500. Listed as compensation for family discretion regarding E.H. incident. His finger moved down the page. July 1889, payment to the Keene family, $3,000. Same notation. And here, he flipped forward, 6 other payments over the past decade. Different families, different amounts, but always the same notation. E.H. Edmund Holloway. The room went silent as the implications settled over them like a shroud. 6 others. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper, at least. Maybe more that aren't recorded here, or that were handled differently. Mitchell closed the ledger. This isn't just about Edmund anymore. The governor has been actively covering up his brother's crimes for a decade, paying families to stay silent, destroying evidence, using his position to protect a serial predator. Silas felt something cold and heavy settle in his chest. This is bigger than we thought. Much bigger, Mitchell agreed. And much more dangerous. If we expose this, we're not just going after Edmund Holloway. We're going after the governor himself, his entire administration, everyone who knew and looked the other way. The backlash will be... He paused, searching for the right word. Brutal doesn't begin to describe it. Where did you get this ledger? Rebecca asked. I told you, a source who wants to remain anonymous. Someone inside the governor's office who's had enough, who saw what you and Catherine suffered and couldn't stay silent anymore. Mitchell looked at them each in turn. This ledger is evidence of a criminal conspiracy. It proves the governor knew about Edmund's actions and actively worked to conceal them. It's enough to bring formal charges against both men. But using it means revealing your source, Silas finished. Putting that person at risk, more than that. It means starting a war. The governor will fight back with everything he has. He'll call the ledger fabricated, claim I stole it, accuse me of political sabotage. His allies in the press will destroy my reputation. My career in politics will effectively be over. Mitchell smiled grimly. I'm willing to pay that price. But I need to know that the people I'm fighting for are willing to stand with me. That Catherine and Rebecca and any other victims we find are ready to testify, to face the public scrutiny, to withstand the attacks that will come. Rebecca looked at the ledger, then at her father, then at Silas. Catherine, the woman you found, she's really willing to do this, to testify. She is, Silas said. She's terrified, but she's done running. Done letting Edmund control her life through fear. Then so am I, Rebecca said firmly. I'll testify. I'll tell everything that happened. And if there are 6 other women out there, we'll find them. We'll all stand together, and maybe that will be enough. William Townsend put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. We're with you, Senator. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, we'll see this through. Mitchell gathered up the ledger carefully, almost reverently. Then we start tomorrow. We go public with Catherine's testimony, announce that other victims are coming forward, and present this ledger as evidence of systematic corruption. We file formal charges against both Edmund and the governor, and then we brace for impact. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca stopped Silas at the door. Thank you, she said quietly, for listening to Catherine, for not ignoring her the way everyone ignored me. Sometimes I think the worst part wasn't what Edmund did. It was knowing that people heard me crying for help and chose not to hear. Silas thought of that night in the ballroom, the muffled sound that everyone else dismissed as pipes or wind. I almost didn't act either, he admitted. Almost told myself I was imagining it, that it wasn't my business, but something wouldn't let me walk away. Maybe it was my daughter's memory, reminding me that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of evil. Rebecca squeezed his hand briefly. Well, thank God for your daughter's memory. And thank God you listened. On the carriage ride back to the Mitchell home, Silas and the senator sat in contemplative silence. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on both of them. You understand what this means, Mitchell said finally. Once we make this public, there's no going back. Win or lose, everything changes. For all of us. I understand, Silas said. He thought of his mountains, his cabin, the quiet life he'd built. It would still be there when this was over, but he wouldn't be the same man who'd left it. Some fights choose you. You don't get to walk away just because they're hard. Mitchell smiled. You're a good man, Silas Boone. I'm glad chance brought you to Denver. So am I, Silas said, surprising himself with the truth of it. So am I. The news broke like a thunderstorm over Denver. Senator Mitchell called a press conference the following morning, standing on the courthouse steps with Catherine and Rebecca flanking him, the ledger displayed on a podium before him. Reporters from every newspaper in the territory crowded the steps. Their cameras flashing, their pencils flying across notepads. Silas stood off to the side, uncomfortable with the attention, but refusing to leave Catherine's side. She'd asked him to be there, and he'd promised he would stay until this was finished. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell began, his voice carrying across the crowd. I stand before you today to present evidence of a crime that has been concealed for far too long. Edmund Holloway has, over the past decade, abducted and imprisoned multiple young women. His brother, Governor Charles Holloway, has known about these crimes and has actively worked to cover them up, paying families for their silence and destroying evidence. The crowd erupted. Questions were shouted, cameras flashed more frantically. Mitchell raised his hand for silence. Miss Catherine Mercer and Miss Rebecca Townsend are here today to tell their stories, to speak truth to power, regardless of the cost. And I have here, he placed his hand on the ledger, documented proof of Governor Holloway's complicity in concealing his brother's crimes. I'm calling for immediate criminal charges against both men and for a full investigation into everyone who aided in this conspiracy. Catherine stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. 3 weeks ago, Edmund Holloway imprisoned me behind a false wall in the governor's mansion. He told me no one would believe me. He told me I was nothing without a powerful man to protect me. He was wrong. Mr. Silas Boone heard my cries and broke through that wall, quite literally, to save me. And now I'm here to make sure Edmund can never do to another woman what he did to me. Rebecca spoke next, her testimony even more damning because of the time that had passed. 2 years ago, Edmund Holloway held me captive for 3 months. When I was finally released, the governor paid my family to remain silent. I lived with that shame, that silence, for 2 years. But no more. I'm here today to say that what happened to Catherine could have been prevented if I'd been brave enough to speak 2 years ago. If there are other women out there who Edmund hurt, I want you to know you're not alone anymore. The press conference lasted 2 hours. Mitchell presented the ledger page by page, explaining each entry. Catherine and Rebecca answered questions about their ordeals, their voices growing stronger as they spoke. And through it all, Silas watched the crowd, seeing the shift as skepticism gave way to outrage, as disbelief transformed into fury at the abuse of power laid bare. By afternoon, extra editions of every newspaper in Denver were on the streets. Governor's brother accused of serial abduction. Holloway dynasty and scandal. Mountain man hero exposes political corruption. The story spread like wildfire, and public opinion began to turn. But the Holloways didn't go quietly. That evening, as Silas, Catherine, and the Mitchells sat down to dinner, a brick crashed through the dining room window. Glass exploded across the table, and Catherine screamed. Silas was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between the window and the others. Wrapped around the brick was a note. "Liars will burn." Senator Mitchell sent for the police, but when they arrived, they were perfunctory at best. The officer who took the report was visibly uncomfortable, rushing through the questions and refusing to meet their eyes. When Mitchell pressed him about protection, the officer said resources were stretched thin, that they couldn't spare men for guard duty. "They've gotten to the police," Mitchell said after the officers left. "The governor still has enough influence to make the authorities look the other way. Then we protect ourselves," Silas said. He'd already sent word to the trading post, asking for his rifle to be brought down from the mountains. It would arrive in 2 days. In the meantime, he kept his knife close and slept lightly. The threats escalated. Anonymous letters arrived daily, describing in graphic detail what would happen to Catherine and Rebecca if they didn't recant their testimony. Someone tried to break into the Mitchell home one night, but Silas heard them and chased them off. The newspapers that had initially supported their cause began printing editorials questioning the women's credibility, suggesting they were in it for money or fame. Through it all, Catherine and Rebecca held firm. They met with prosecutors, gave detailed statements, helped identify other potential victims from the ledger entries. 2 more women came forward, encouraged by their courage: Margaret Keane, who'd been held for 6 months 4 years ago, and a younger woman named Sarah Porter, who'd escaped Edmund's attempt to abduct her just last year, but had been too frightened to report it. The prosecutors, led by District Attorney James Thornton, began building their case. But progress was slow, hampered by witnesses who suddenly couldn't remember details, by evidence that mysteriously disappeared, by legal maneuvers from the Holloway's expensive attorneys. Silas watched it all unfold with growing frustration. The system was working exactly as Senator Mitchell had warned, designed to protect powerful men, to exhaust and discourage those seeking justice. 1 week before the hearing was scheduled, Silas received a visitor at the Mitchell home. A well-dressed man in his 40s carrying a leather briefcase, who introduced himself as Martin Graves, attorney for the Holloway family. "Mr. Boone, I'm here to make you an offer." Silas crossed his arms. "Not interested. You haven't heard it yet. The Holloway family recognizes your role in bringing this unfortunate situation to light. They're prepared to offer you $50,000 to return to your mountains and leave Denver politics to Denver." Politicians. The amount was staggering, more money than Silas would see in 10 lifetimes of trapping and trading. Enough to ensure he'd never want for anything. But it was also an insult, a suggestion that his principles had a price. "No," Graves smiled thinly. "Perhaps you don't understand. $50,000, Mr. Boone. You could buy land, build a proper home, live comfortably for the rest of your life. All for simply stepping away from a fight that isn't yours." "It became my fight the moment I heard Catherine crying," Silas said. "And a man's conscience isn't for sale. Not for 50,000. Not for any amount." "That's unfortunate." Graves snapped his briefcase shut. "Because the alternative to accepting this generous offer is that we destroy you. We'll dig into your past, find every mistake you've ever made, and plaster it across every newspaper in the territory. We'll paint you as an opportunist, a con man who manipulated vulnerable women for attention. By the time we're done, no one will believe a word you say." "Let them try," Silas said calmly. "I've lived an honest life. There's nothing in my past I'm ashamed of. Everyone has something, Mr. Boone, and if we can't find it, we'll make it up. Who do you think people will believe? A respected legal family or an isolated mountain man with no reputation to defend?" Before Silas could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. She must have been listening from the hall. "Get out," she said coldly. "Get out of this house and tell the Holloways that threatening us only proves we're telling the truth." Graves looked at her with undisguised contempt. "Miss Mercer. Still playing the victim, I see. You do understand that at trial we'll present evidence of your history of emotional instability, of your inappropriate relationship with your father that some might find disturbing." Catherine's face went white, but her voice remained steady. "My father was a good man who raised me with love and respect. If you try to twist that into something ugly, it will only show the depths of your depravity. We'll see what a jury thinks, Graves said. He turned back to Silas. Last chance, Mr. Boone. Take the money and walk away. Save yourself from what's coming. I'm not going anywhere, Silas said. Except maybe to the witness stand, where I'll tell a jury exactly what kind of men the Holloways are. After Graves left, Catherine collapsed into a chair, shaking. They're going to destroy us, aren't they? No matter what the truth is, they'll twist it until no one knows what to believe. Silas knelt beside her. They'll try. But the truth has weight, Catherine. It has gravity. Lies float away eventually, but truth settles deep. You just have to hold on long enough for people to feel that weight. Senator Mitchell entered, having been alerted to Graves's visit by his household staff. They offered you money? 50,000, Silas confirmed. Turn them down. Mitchell whistled low. That's a fortune. They must be getting desperate if they're offering that much, or they're confident they can make it disappear if I don't take it, Silas said. Either way, it doesn't matter. I gave my word I'd see this through. That night, Silas sat in the study with Mitchell planning for the hearing. The senator had mapped out their strategy. Catherine would testify first, followed by Rebecca, then the other victims. The ledger would be presented as evidence, along with testimony from the anonymous source who'd provided it. Silas would testify about discovering Catherine, and the prosecutors would paint a picture of systematic abuse enabled by political power. It's a strong case, Mitchell said. But Judge Harrison will be under enormous pressure to dismiss it. The Holloways have called in every favor they're owed, and I mean every one. The hearing could go either way. What are our chances? Honestly, Mitchell was silent for a long moment, maybe 50-50. The evidence is damning, but the Holloways have money, influence, and a legal team that's never lost a major case. They'll attack the women's credibility, question the ledger's authenticity, paint you as a troublemaker and me as a political opportunist. It'll be ugly, uglier than what Edmund did to those women? No, Mitchell admitted. No, not uglier than that. 2 days before the hearing, Silas's rifle arrived from the mountains, brought by old Samuel Briggs, who'd made the trip specially. Along with it came a package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a letter from one of the trappers who lived near Silas's cabin. Figured you might need this, the letter read. Some of us heard what you're doing down there in Denver, standing up to those corrupt politicians. We're proud to know you, Silas. Give them hell. The package contained ammunition for his rifle, more than he'd need, and a carved wooden token, the kind the Ute used to give to warriors before battle. A calling card, a symbol of honor and the old ways. Silas turned the token over in his weathered hands, feeling its weight, its meaning. He thought about the mountains he'd left behind, the isolation he'd chosen, the 20 years spent running from connection and consequence. He thought about Catherine, Rebecca, Margaret, Sarah, women who'd found the courage to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. And he thought about his daughter, Sarah, who'd had her mother's courage and her father's stubborn refusal to back down from what was right. This was for all of them, for the ones who'd been hurt and the ones who'd been silenced and the one small girl who'd taught him that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. On the morning of the hearing, Silas dressed in his best clothes, checked his knife out of habit, even though he wouldn't be allowed to carry it into the courthouse, and met Catherine at the bottom of the stairs. She looked pale but determined, wearing a simple dress that made her look younger than her years, but dignified in its modesty. In her hand, she clutched the pressed wildflower he'd given her, the mountain columbine that grew in impossible places. Ready? He asked. No, she said honestly. But I'm going anyway. That's all courage is, Silas told her. Being afraid and doing it anyway. They rode to the courthouse together. Silas, Catherine, Rebecca, Senator Mitchell, and the other women who'd agreed to testify. The streets were lined with people, some cheering support, others shouting accusations and threats. Reporters pressed close, shouting questions. Police held back the crowd, but barely. As they climbed the courthouse steps, Silas looked up at the building, white stone, imposing columns, the words, "Justice for all," carved above the entrance. He wondered if those words had ever been true, or if they'd always been just another facade. Another wall hiding the reality that justice was often for sale to the highest bidder. But today, they would at least try to make those words mean something. Today, they would speak truth and trust that somewhere in that courthouse, someone would have the courage to listen. The doors opened, and they stepped inside. The afternoon session began with Silas taking the stand. He placed his weathered hand on the Bible and swore his oath, then settled into the witness chair, uncomfortable under the scrutiny of so many eyes, but determined to speak his truth. Thornton walked him through the events of that night, the banquet, the crying he'd heard, his decision to investigate, despite the social pressure to ignore it. Mr. Boone, what made you certain that what you heard wasn't simply the building settling or pipes, as others suggested? I've spent 20 years in the mountains, Silas said. You learn to listen to the wilderness, to distinguish between the sounds that are natural and the ones that mean trouble. What I heard that night was human suffering, unmistakable, and when I pressed my hand against that wall, I could feel it was wrong, hollow where it shouldn't be, built recently to hide something. And when you broke through the wall, what did you find? Miss Mercer, bruised, terrified, barely able to stand. She'd been locked in darkness for 3 weeks with minimal food and water. When she pointed at Edmund Holloway and identified him as her captor, I knew she was telling the truth. You can't fake that kind of fear, that kind of recognition. The Holloway attorneys rose for cross-examination, and Blackwood approached with barely concealed contempt. Mr. Boone, you live alone in the mountains, is that correct? Yes. How long has it been since you've had regular interaction with civilized society? 20 years, more or less. 20 years of isolation. No regular human contact. No experience with modern social conventions. Blackwood paused for effect. Isn't it possible that in your, shall we say, unfamiliarity with refined society, you misinterpreted what was happening that night? I didn't misinterpret a woman locked behind a wall, Silas said flatly. But you did interrupt a private social gathering, destroy property, and make accusations against a respected family based solely on your interpretation of sounds others couldn't hear. Isn't that the behavior of someone whose judgment might be compromised by isolation? My judgment is fine. What's compromised is a society that ignores a woman's cries for help, because acknowledging them would be socially inconvenient. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gallery. Blackwood's jaw tightened. You saved the life of Senator Mitchell's son, correct? Just weeks before this incident. I helped him, yes. And the senator, out of gratitude, invited you to the banquet, introduced you to important people. Made you feel special, perhaps? Important? Silas saw where this was going. He thanked me for helping his son. Nothing more. Isn't it true that you've been staying at Senator Mitchell's home since that night? That he's provided for your needs, paid your expenses. He's given me a place to stay while I testify, yes. How convenient. The senator, who has political aspirations of his own, provides for a witness whose testimony supports his case against his political rival. And you expect this court to believe you're an objective witness? I expect this court to believe I tell the truth, Silas said, his voice hardening. Senator Mitchell didn't tell me what to see or what to say. I know what I heard, what I found, and what it meant. And no amount of twisting my words will change those facts. Facts? Or the interpretation of a man who spent 2 decades talking to himself in the wilderness. That was too far. Judge Harrison intervened. Mr. Blackwood, confine your questions to relevant matters. The witness's living situation doesn't negate his testimony. But the seed had been planted, the suggestion that Silas was unreliable, possibly unstable, certainly biased. The defense team smiled, satisfied they'd done enough damage. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Edmund Holloway took the stand in his own defense. He was polished, smooth, every inch the wronged gentleman. He denied everything, claimed Catherine had come to the mansion willingly, that she'd had a breakdown during their conversation, that he'd tried to help her, but she'd become violent and confused. He suggested Silas had been seeking attention, that Senator Mitchell had orchestrated the entire thing for political gain, that the ledger was fabricated. "I loved Catherine," Edmund said, his voice catching with practiced emotion. "I wanted to help her through her grief. Instead, I've been falsely accused of monstrous crimes by people with political agendas. My family's reputation, built over generations of service to Colorado, has been destroyed by lies. It was a masterful performance. Even Silas, who knew the truth, could see how it might sway those who wanted to believe in the goodness of powerful men." Then Thornton began his cross-examination. "Mr. Holloway, if Miss Mercer came to the mansion willingly, why didn't anyone on your staff see her arrive?" I gave them the evening off. For privacy. How convenient. And the space behind the wall where she was found, when was that constructed?" "I don't know. It was already there when, according to the building's original architect, whom we've interviewed, that space didn't exist in the original design. It was added within the last year." "Can you explain that?" Edmund's composure cracked slightly. "Perhaps renovations were done, renovations that you personally oversaw, according to the construction permits we've obtained. Renovations that created a hidden room with a lockable door on the outside." "What possible purpose would such a space serve, Mr. Holloway?" Storage, perhaps. I don't recall the specific. You don't recall personally designing and overseeing the construction of a hidden room in your brother's mansion? A room where Miss Mercer was found imprisoned." The courtroom was dead silent. Edmund's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air. "Furthermore," Thornton continued, "we have testimony from Rebecca Townsend, Margaret Keene, and Sarah Porter, all describing identical patterns of behavior, all identifying you as their attacker, all describing imprisonment in hidden spaces. Are we to believe that 4 separate women have fabricated identical stories about you?" "They're lying. They were paid to lie, probably by Mitchell. If they were paid by Senator Mitchell, why did your family pay them to stay silent years before this trial? Explain the ledger entries, Mr. Holloway. Explain why the governor paid these families if their claims were false." Edmund opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. He looked desperately at his attorneys, at his brother in the gallery. But no one could save him from his own words, his own contradictions. I need to consult with my counsel. Answer the question, Mr. Holloway." "I invoke my right to—" Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Holloway, you took the stand voluntarily. You must answer the prosecutor's questions or be held in contempt." Edmund stood abruptly, his composure completely shattered. "This is a conspiracy. All of you, you're all against me because of my family's name, because we represent the old ways, the proper ways. These women are nothing, and you're destroying me for them." The courtroom erupted. Edmund's own words, his naked contempt, his admission that he saw the women as nothing. It was more damning than any evidence could be. Catherine sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of vindication, of finally being believed, of watching the man who'd hurt her reveal himself for what he truly was. Silas caught her eye and nodded. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd done it. The truth had weight after all. 2 weeks after the trial concluded, Silas stood on the front porch of Senator Mitchell's home, watching the autumn sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. His saddlebag sat at his feet, packed and ready. His rifle leaned against the railing. It was time to go home. Edmund Holloway had been convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and unlawful imprisonment. The judge had sentenced him to 20 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of parole. Governor Charles Holloway had resigned his office in disgrace, facing his own trial for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The ledger had proven his downfall, irrefutable evidence that he'd known about his brother's crimes and actively worked to conceal them. The political machine the Holloways had built over generations crumbled in a matter of days. Officials who'd depended on their patronage scrambled to distance themselves. Newspapers that had defended them now wrote scathing editorials about the corruption that had festered at the heart of Colorado politics. Reform movements sprung up across the territory, demanding transparency and accountability. But for Silas, the real victory was quieter, more personal. Catherine emerged from the house, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She'd put on weight in the past 2 weeks, the hollowness leaving her cheeks, the color returning to her face. She moved with more confidence now, her head held high, her step sure. "You're really leaving," she said, though it wasn't a question. "Time to get back," Silas said. "Winter comes early in the high country. Need to lay in supplies, check the cabin, make sure everything's ready. You could stay, you know. Senator Mitchell said he'd help you find a position here in Denver. You've become something of a folk hero. People want to know you, hear your stories." Silas smiled but shook his head. "I'm not meant for city life, Catherine. These past weeks have reminded me of that. Too much noise, too many people, too many walls. The mountains are where I belong." Catherine nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I'm going to miss you. You saved my life, Silas. Not just from Edmund, but from believing I deserved what happened to me. From thinking I was as worthless as he said. You were never worthless. You just needed someone to hear you when you called for help, and you listened when no one else would." Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I want you to have this. I know you keep a journal, and I thought, well, I filled this with some thoughts. About healing, about finding strength again. I thought maybe when you're up in your mountains, you might read it and remember that you made a difference. That you changed lives." Silas took the journal carefully, touched by the gesture. "I'll treasure it. And I'll think of you often, wondering how you're doing, hoping you found some peace." "I'm getting there," Catherine said. "Rebecca and I have started an organization to help other women who've experienced violence. We're calling it the Mountain Columbine Society, after the flower you gave me. We're going to provide legal support, safe housing, whatever women need to rebuild their lives after trauma. Senator Mitchell is helping us secure funding." "That's good work," Silas said, pride warming his chest. "Important work, it is. And it wouldn't exist if you hadn't broken through that wall. If you hadn't shown me that one person can make a difference." She stepped closer and took his weathered hand in both of hers. "Thank you, Silas Boone. Thank you for not walking away when it would have been easier. Thank you for believing me." They embraced briefly, and Silas felt the weight of responsibility lifting from his shoulders. Catherine would be all right. She'd found her purpose, her voice, her strength. She didn't need protecting anymore. Senator Mitchell joined them on the porch, extending his hand. "I hope you'll visit sometimes. Come down from those mountains and let us know how you're doing." "Maybe," Silas said, shaking his hand firmly. "Maybe I will. The offer stands, Silas. If you ever want to come back, work with us on reform efforts. Use your story to help change things. The door is open. I appreciate that. But I think my part in this is done. The rest is up to people like you and Catherine. People who know how to navigate these systems, who can speak the language of politics and law. I'm just a mountain man who broke a wall when he heard someone crying." "You're more than that," Mitchell said. "You're a reminder that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and win." "That's powerful, Silas. Don't underestimate what you've done here." Silas picked up his saddlebag and slung it over his shoulder, then collected his rifle. He looked back at the house where he'd spent these past weeks, at the city spreading out beyond it, at the two people who'd become as close to family as he'd allowed anyone to be in 20 years. "Take care of each other," he said. "And take care of Rebecca and Margaret and Sarah and all the others. Make sure their courage meant something." "We will," Catherine promised. "I swear it." Silas walked down the steps and climbed onto his horse, a sturdy mountain-bred mare that had waited patiently for this moment. As he turned the horse toward the road that would lead him back to the high country, Catherine called out one last time, "Silas, will you come back? For the anniversary of the trial or just to visit?" He thought about it, really considered it. The old Silas, the one who'd fled to the mountains 20 years ago, would have said no, would have ridden away and never looked back, would have chosen isolation over connection, because connection meant the possibility of loss. But that Silas had died somewhere in these past weeks, replaced by someone who understood that isolation wasn't safety. It was just another kind of prison. "I'll come back," he said. "Next spring, maybe. Check on how that society of yours is doing." Catherine's smile was brighter than the morning sun. "I'll hold you to that." Silas urged his horse forward, out of the city, onto the trail that led up into the foothills and beyond. As Denver fell away behind him, he felt the familiar peace of the wilderness settling over him like a comfortable coat. The air grew cleaner, sharper. The sounds of civilization faded, replaced by wind and birdsong and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. But something was different this time. He wasn't running anymore. He was returning to his cabin, his mountains, his chosen solitude. But he was returning as someone who'd faced the world and found he still had something to offer it. Someone who'd discovered that caring about others, fighting for justice, standing up when it would be easier to sit down, these things didn't make a man weak. They made him whole. He reached into his jacket and felt the journal Catherine had given him. Tonight, when he made camp, he'd read her words. And maybe he'd write some of his own, recording this journey not as an ending, but as a new beginning. The trail wound higher, into country where the aspens burned gold and the air tasted of coming snow. Silas breathed deep, feeling something in his chest unlock. For 20 years, he'd carried his grief like a stone, heavy and immovable. It was still there. He'd never stopped missing his wife and daughter, but the weight had shifted, become bearable, even meaningful. Their memory had driven him to save Catherine, to fight for justice, to remember what mattered. They would be proud, he thought. Sarah especially. She'd have liked Catherine's courage, Rebecca's determination. She'd have insisted on joining the fight herself. Stubborn girl that she'd been. The thought made him smile instead of hurt. And that felt like healing. As the sun climbed toward noon, Silas paused at a ridgeline to look back one last time at Denver, spread out in the valley below. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful, its conflicts and corruptions invisible. He could see the courthouse where truth had finally been heard, the governor's mansion where Catherine's ordeal had ended, the streets where ordinary people lived their lives, most of them decent folk just trying to do right by their families. It was a good city, or could be, had the potential to be. People like Senator Mitchell and Catherine and all those who'd stood up during the trial, they'd make sure that potential wasn't wasted. Silas turned his horse toward the high country and rode on. The mountains welcomed him home, silent, eternal, uncomplicated. His cabin would be there exactly as he'd left it. His traps, his trails, his life of chosen solitude. But now there was a leather journal in his saddlebag and a promise to return next spring. And somehow that made the solitude feel less like running and more like resting between rounds of a fight that would continue as long as there were people willing to listen when others cried for help. He'd done his part. He'd heard someone crying and hadn't looked away. In a world full of walls and secrets and comfortable lies, that was enough. That mattered. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is refuse to look away when others won't see. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. Silas Boone rode into the mountains, carrying that truth with him. And if anyone asked, though up here there was no one to ask, he'd say he had no regrets. Not about breaking that wall. Not about staying to see justice done. Not about learning, finally, that a man could come down from his isolation without losing himself, could connect with others without being destroyed by loss. The wilderness stretched ahead, familiar and welcoming. But now he knew it wasn't a prison or a hiding place. It was just home. And he'd always be able to leave it again if someone needed help, if a voice cried out in darkness, if courage required company. For now, though, the mountains were calling, and Silas Boone answered. The trail rose higher, into the clean air and honest dangers of the high country, where a man could think and breathe and remember what mattered, where strong things grew in hard places, where the silence wasn't lonely anymore, it was just quiet enough to hear yourself become whole again.